It is my extreme privilege and honor to introduce our speaker. But I wanted to welcome you to our last evening event of the semester. We do try to have some sort of programming here every Thursday night during the school year, so we hope you will come back and join us next semester. A newsletter will be coming out soon with all that information, and we have some wonderful exhibitions and speakers coming up. So we'd like to invite you back to join us next semester. So I've had a chance to spend a little time this week with our speaker, and she has been out and almost touched a bison on the Kansa Prairie. So we now make her an honorary K-Stater because she's had that great experience. Some friends of ours have taken her out, so that's really great. And Jacqueline Bishop is a world traveler who explores and records the connections between humans and the rest of the natural world through her landscapes. She's witnessed forest fires in the Amazon, Hurricane Katrina from her home in New Orleans, and the BP oil spill on the Gulf Coast, and her work addresses the loss of the natural environment, species extinction, and eco-political injustice, and calls on us, as inhabitants of the biome Earth, to be aware. Jacqueline studied art and philosophy at KU and has degrees from the University of New Orleans and Tulane. In addition to her artistic endeavors, she has taught about art and the environment and studio art at a number of universities in New Orleans, in the New Orleans area, and lectures and exhibits internationally. She is the author of Chico Mendes, M. Memoria, which is a tribute to the Brazilian rubber tapper who was assassinated by cattle ranchers in the 1980s. She has received awards and grants from the Pollock Krasner, Joan Mitchell, and Warhol Foundations, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and the Louisiana Division of Arts, and several awards for a radio program that she did on Louisiana artists on NPR. In addition to her KU affiliation, Jacqueline works with Zanata Studios here in Kansas, and mother lives in St. Joseph, Missouri. So we consider her one of our own, and I am pleased to introduce Jacqueline Bishop.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here and for this beautiful, beautiful exhibit at the beach. Collecting the work and exhibiting it the way that you have. It's a great pleasure to be here and to learn so much these last 2 days. And the bison, I have to say, was the most amazing experience. Many thanks, many thanks to Catherine and everyone here. I mean, Lindsay, the way he installed the exhibition is just amazing. And today, I mean, it was just today and yesterday, and many thanks to Joe and Barb Zanata for their incredible support and for connecting me to the beach. It's just been really wonderful, and it's been great to work with the Zanatas. This collection here at the beach presents a wide time range from around the mid-'80s to the present, so I'm going to begin the talk with the older work, the process of the work, and then end with the current work. I have a show up right now in New Orleans at the Arthur Roger Gallery, and I'm going to just show you a few of those in the very end. My process is not just in the studio, but outside the studio also, through the travels with field scientists and sometimes alone. I learned so much by traveling with scientists that I started choosing who I would travel with and where I would go. My view is that culture comes from the landscape, which means we are shaped by our landscapes. And a changing landscape not only affects the physical and social climates, but the psychological climate of our being. As we are seeing in many parts of the world right now, it is climate change that could be viewed as the root of migration, violence, and war. In this piece titled Terra, it's an installation, a wall installation begun in 1986 and comprised of over 750 bird portraits from areas of political fire such as South Africa, South America, and Central America. This was during apartheid when I started this in South Africa, which existed between 1948 and 1995. The word apartheid was coined in the 1930s for a political slogan and means apartness or separateness. But here I mixed all of the bird species together, and ornithologists, if you're here, would know that many of these bird species would never interact with each other. These portraits are about 3.5 by 3.5 inches each, and they're installed in a grid-like system, but not a perfect grid, anti-Descartes, but inspired by the first bird list created by Swedish biologist Carolus Linnaeus between 1735 and 1758, titled Systema Naturae. In the midst of doing the bird research, I discovered many of the birds that I had been painting were extinct. And the word extinct was such a strong word, I didn't even think about that the time I was doing the research. And through the process, I learned that birds are the most important because they are widespread and they travel, and they plant the trees. I framed them in select street garbage that I collected on my travels. I added different elements like bird nests, journal entries, studio floor debris, Mardi Gras beads, things from the forest floor. Then I added the corridor of insects created at Virginia Commonwealth University with Ted Potter in Richmond. And we used gauze. It's a gauze-like fabric, covered with butterflies cut from discarded South American newsprint. And I collaborated with the New York composer, Chris Becker, to write a sound installation for the butterflies and another for Tara, and he titled this 200 Birds, which were both very haunting pieces of electronic music that flowed together mysteriously and worked with the flow of the gauze in the wind and the flow of the bird landscape. And Tara grew to 60 feet, working on it for 18 years, and it was meant to present one day in the life of a bird from dawn to dusk, from the light of morning to the heat of midday and dark midnight. I consider this landscape a painting, a landscape painting. I like the fact that for over 200 years there has been a handful of artists quietly exploring the forests of the Americas. In some cases, scientists are looking at 15th and 16th century landscape paintings by Bosch, Bruegel, and Jan van Eyck, just to study the European birds, mammals, and plants that no longer exists. So these paintings become documentation. I studied bird skins at the LSU Ornithology Department, and one of the most respected and well-organized collections in the world, besides, of course, Cornell and Chicago. I memorized birds from Brazil that would later migrate to Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi each spring. This particular bird is the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker that became extinct in 1942. We actually talked about this at lunch today because at one point, some amateur bird watchers in Arkansas and then some in Louisiana were out in the swamps, and they swore they saw one because it has a huge wingspan, and they recorded the sound, but of course it was impossible. It became extinct in 1942. But they alerted Cornell and LSU and the scientists, and they both told each other to swear not to tell anybody because they didn't want those damn bird watchers out there messing things up and moving around in the water and everything. So they got there and studied it for days and then weeks. They never found anything, but the amateur bird watcher to this day claims he saw it, and no one has seen anything since. But I did hear the cousin of it lived in Cuba. It was not called an ivory-billed woodpecker, but something similar, and it was a little smaller. And so I went to Cuba last year thinking I'm just going to go see this bird, but I got there and found it was extinct. These are euphonias from South America. To each bird is attached a tag with information about location, wingspan, stomach content, gender, and the name of the scientist who collected it. Scientists learn about our habitat through this process, and they study the gut and all that. These are mountain tanagers. The tanagers are some of my favorites, and of course they're on, on the ground and up in the mountains. There's many kinds, and this was in 1988. I was being introduced to more bird extinction, and also to the news that Brazilian cattle ranchers assassinated the rubber tapper forest activist Chico Mendes. And with this news, I was compelled to study Portuguese. I left the studio for Amazonia, where I befriended Chico's widow, his family, his colleagues, interviewed them for years, and ended up doing a series of portraits of Chico Mendes, even though I'm not a portrait painter. I don't do many human figures. But I did it on the anniversary of his death every year for 10 years, which ended up in a small book titled In Memoria, published on the 10-year anniversary of his death in 1988. The jungle is very mysterious. It's peaceful, surreal, and calming, but also it's very delicate. No two trees grow alike side by side. The soil is not rich. The nutrients are in the leaves. So when the forest is destroyed, it becomes desert about after 3 years. Here in Brazil, when you consider there are approximately 9,040 bird species in the world, and here in the Amazon basin are almost a third of those, it's quite humbling. But for me, metaphorically, Amazonia is a mirror. This is a reflection of us, who we are, and seeing this beauty and experiencing it. Then witnessing the destruction makes it impossible to return to the studio and not be moved, as if as if I had never seen this. This is Sama Uma. It's a 7-color serigraph, also included in the show and on the banner that they made, which just turned out beautifully, by the way. And the Sama Uma tree is considered by many Brazilians and scientists who study them the most beautiful tree in the forest. And it's a hardwood, and it's the last tree standing after a forest fire. It takes a couple of days to get to the area where I want to go, and I camp out. I document forest deforestation, birds, of course, orchids, medicinal plants. There are no roads in Amazonia. The rivers are the roads. The streams are the roads. And this is my studio, deep in the heart of the Amazon. And of course, I don't do my oil paintings there or anything like that because of the insects. But here at the Rio Negro is the process. I fill sketchbooks, journals, write lectures, and I document. We study birds at night that we will see at 5 in the morning. These field guides are placed all over the river settlements, in airports and offices. It's their culture. And these are the wooden diaries. These are carved birds I collect from the Ticuna Indians to help support them, but also I write my journals on them. I consider them books. In the early 90s, I decided to make use of the natural resources, so I took watercolors and paper. I dipped the paper in the brown river, hoping it would stain the paper. But the paper came out cleaner. So I decided to mix the Amazon river water with my watercolor and make small paintings reflecting the essence of the landscape and just let the watercolor do what it does in a rainforest, with the tiny drops falling right onto the painting. I was not interested in all the elaborate details that I do in my paintings and drawings, which became 25 paintings of the landscape made from the river water and could not have been done anywhere else, which became the installation titled Silhouette, which is covered with a veil of 182 birds draping from the ceiling over the watercolors. Detail of silhouette. The word silhouette refers to a bird-watching term during the act of looking through binoculars at the end of the day, but the light is disappearing, making it difficult to identify the species, so it becomes a black silhouette. Silhouetta is a similar wall installation, but with drawings over collage. I refer to the drawings as the dark organisms. This is a detail. And this is one of the dark organism drawings in this show. And I collect newsprint with language on it from different countries and make the collage, and then I do drawings over it, as is this one. I love paper, any kind of paper. This piece is titled Ghosts. Ghosts was made of 1,000 hand-cut butterflies from discarded Brazilian newspapers. In Brazil, I gave away my clothes to make room in my luggage for the newspapers and other discarded materials. Each butterfly was dipped in beeswax, attached to fishing wire, then attached with a safety pin to a distorted butterfly net. The newspapers were made from trees in the Amazon, so I essentially brought Amazonia to Louisiana. There's a path on the inside and viewers can enter, but some chose not to enter and just walk around the installation, and others entered and didn't want to come out. So it was really an interesting approach to the psychological connections to intimacy with nature. Trespass was done in 2004 to 2005, a 7-foot framed assemblage comprised of antique frame, hundreds of artificial birds, baby shoes, bird nests, and toys with hand-painted images of the natural world on the wings and backs of the birds, all assembled nest-like in its own ecosystem. It was similar to nest building, to building a nest. This is a detail. The results and the response by viewers to this piece was a comparison to floodwaters. And 4 months later, we had Katrina. We experienced the trespass of this storm and, of course, the Corps of Engineers. The water line across the house was the water level across the city. 82% of New Orleans was completely underwater. No one escaped without some form of loss. If your home did not get water, you had many other complications. There were no birds. There was just complete silence. All different neighborhoods of class and culture were affected. And if you know New Orleans, it's made up of hundreds and hundreds of different neighborhoods. The garbage was piled high from people's homes and many football fields long and dumped into the disappearing wetlands. This was a walkway park. Lifeline is a large-scale painting, the only painting I did that entire year. The colorful line across the middle represents the endless water line that covered the city. This is a detail. So every little inch, it takes, I think it took me a year to paint that painting, but it was the only one I did that year because I really sort of gave up painting for a while, I think. But, it was also a testimony to the hope that I had and the optimistic, because I didn't stop painting. And I think that it was my attempt to turn the ugly into some form of beauty and poetry, because I think that's what artists do. This is titled Edge. It's from the Nest series, symbolizing nest as labor, materials, birth, family. And this is Flight from Reason. Nest as security, home, shelter. And we all build nests ourselves. This is titled Feast. In 2008, I was approached by Aorta, a community-based rebuilding organization using art to bring back neighborhoods. I was so excited about this. I wanted to use bird imagery to symbolize us. I drew over 100 Louisiana bird species and cut stencils for the crew to paint over each species to create field guide. I chose the Gentilly neighborhood, which had been under like 13 feet of water, and we painted birds on the driveway leading up to the Milne Boys' Home, and it was a boys' orphanage, and it was where Louis Armstrong grew up in the Milne Boys' Home, although his home was in a different location, but I loved that connection because I love Louis Armstrong and the music that came out of New Orleans. And Aorta organized a daily crew for 9 days. We never knew who was going to be there, comprised of artists, professors, students, social workers, you name it. The idea for this semi-permanent mural installation was to cover the driveway with over 5,000 bird silhouettes of Louisiana bird species to symbolize migration, and to present the need for New Orleanians to unite and rebuild our city. The surrounding homes were empty still. The community needed to know this neighborhood was important. This is the aerial view. I experimented with different material and ended up using industrial zoning and marking paint, which of course was already on the streets, you know, your parking and all that. And I thought, why didn't I think of that? Why did I spend so many weeks experimenting with this and just not use that? But I found it, and it lasts for years, and it's still there, and they've renovated this into a recreation place for students, and they were going to tear up the driveway, and somebody said, no, I can't do that. And so far it's still there, and I went out there last week with a New York person who's documenting it and interviewed me on it, and it was still there, faded but still there, and I just couldn't believe it. And it was, you know, beautiful in its faded state. And here's the finished piece. I ended the piece with the beginning of the migration, and I ended it with a hummingbird. A little tiny hummingbird that led it, because in Mississippi, the Biloxi Indians believed that the hummingbird told the truth. And you know how territorial hummingbirds are, and they're so tiny, but they're like the boss. And so I put that as the very first one, because we started the migration from the end of the migration painting, but we ended it with the very first one. And I wanted it done in July, which we finished it, I think, July 9th. And I was so happy because it rained every day and we had to stop. There was lightning coming down, we had to stop, and we finally finished it in that hot New Orleans sun on our hands and knees. And this is another view. But it did indeed get residents' attention, was written about in several thesis papers in California, New York, Louisiana, and the neighborhood did come back. I mean, it wasn't just because of my piece, but some people did come back because of it. But, you know, people came back, and it's a viable, beautiful, freshly painted, manicured yard neighborhood again. This is titled Seeds. The next body of work related to this installation, and I did a bunch of different media. This is Watercolor and Collage. Then in April 20th, 2010, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico inspired many protests here in the French Quarter. Grand Isle State Park in the Gulf was a pristine wetland. Louisiana wetlands are considered some of the most misunderstood landscape in the world. And these are oil-stained grasslands. Everything was very quiet. No wildlife anywhere, nothing. Fish, birds, nothing. And these are dead hermit crabs that could be seen for miles and miles, which we collected. And if we found any live ones, we collected them, cleaned them, and then put them in a backwater area of water and saved thousands. But it wasn't enough. Here, oil can be easily collected from the sand underneath. It stained the landscape for miles. The oil patches covered the beaches. No one was allowed to walk them. I got special permission. A group of art activists created an installation addressing lost culture. And then Sonatina, I met Joe Zanata and his wife Barb. They came to New Orleans and called me, and we met, and this was our first project together, which took 9 months. It was very intense, and it began with a collage, 60 inches long in 2 pieces, and it was seamlessly digitized together. And that was the prep, and then I did a drawing, and it was printed in Santa Fe. It's 5-foot long lithograph on archival digital collage and represents the ideas that culture comes from the landscape. And of course that's in the show, which you can look at up close. And this is the drawing, the original pen drawing that I did on the paper that I have in my, I was looking at it the other day. I never did document it, so I documented it just for this lecture. I couldn't believe I hadn't documented it yet, and I couldn't find it. And I found it rolled up. So it was interesting to see the very original ink drawing that I did that was used for the lithograph. And that was part of the initial process. I love to draw. I love making marks and making images. And this was kind of a streaming of the consciousness. And then this was an actual drawing, not a lithograph, that was in my show 3 years ago, and it's in a private collection. But it's just a straight out drawing over the collage. And it's from the same digitized piece. This is in the show, Choice Flower, burnt umber watercolor over collage with a combination of 100-year-old women's journals and newsprint. Titles for all of these pieces are found in the newsprint, in the collage. You can find the title, and that's how they get their titles. This is Oil Rain, watercolor, and I used water from the Gulf Coast after the oil spill mixed in with the watercolors. There's 2 smaller pieces, Untitled. I'm sure they're titled, but I couldn't remember what they were. And Joe and I had been talking about doing a large print of a field guide of extinct birds for a year or so. And this is the carving of the linoleum, which is labor intensive. And because it's this large of a linoleum piece that I drew and cut, and I did research to make sure that these birds were still extinct, because sometimes they might discover a couple of them. So, and I chose the countries that I traveled, and so there's all of these extinct birds represented, the different countries that I traveled, and this piece, of course, is in, and you have some of the linoleum cuts, and this is in my studio carving. And these are test prints, which I used to gauge the amount of detail I wanted. And this is Joe in Santa Fe sending me the first print, or the first proof of Out of the Blue is the title of it. And I wanted it to be out of the blue because that's what it is. It has nothing to do with the color. So it really became a field guide memorial, which you will see also in this show. So Joe brought the edition so I could sign it, and I don't know why that's like that. And included some that were printed on maps of Brazil and the world. We did a variation of experiments with Out of the Blue. I love maps, especially vintage when they are available, but the colors in these maps were so fresh. I even took it further. I don't know why it's like that. And making a new body of work over 3 years at the time, and this, I just painted right over it with watercolor, just painted roses directly. And that was great. Oops. So I was making a new body of work over 3 years at this time for the exhibition Against the Tide. And this is titled Worldview, Large-Scale Oil on Belgian Linen. worldview. And this is in a private collection. Before the Storm. And this body of work in this show has a lot of water in it. And the Earth image is still there, which started in the Nest series and ended up in the water. Treading Lightly. World Journey. Forest. This was just purchased by the Dominican Republic for the American Embassy. And I lived in the Dominican Republic in 1975, and that's where I was introduced to deforestation. But they don't know that. Procession. Underworld. Boat. And this is my boat. This is the boat that I use in the Amazon. And I named it Orquídea, which is Portuguese for orchid. So I collect water in the Mississippi River to mix with watercolor for a new body of work. I bottle, label, and date the water. And I begin drawing with the watercolor. This is Twilight, sideways. Formation of pearls. Why does that do that? I had it so perfect. No, you're right. If you listen, you will hear. Poets write fancy things. A collection of America. Editorial. Editorial section, sorry. Now to Santa Fe for 3.5 days of making mono prints. So we pulled Migration in deep Prussian blue, one of my favorite colors in ink to print in. And we pulled a ghost print, which means running it through the press, the ghost prints. And sometimes the ghost prints are just as beautiful. But you get to see how much ink could still be on the paper once you pull it up. On to the next print. This is Tear. The prints are done quickly, have less detail, they're more conceptual. It was another experience to leave space, keep it simple and say just what I wanted to say, with very little imagery. Here the tear is a raindrop, but also a human tear created from methane. Oh. This was the first, this was a transfer drawing. I don't know why that's doing that. Is there any way you can turn it the right way? Or will I mess things up?
We did this. We're creative.
Okay. It must be the equipment is not compatible with.
Everything's, just showing horizontally. Although it's not in the air.
This is titled Purple Heart, and there's several processes that went into this, with the transfer drawing and then the mono print, and then I went in and actually did some hand painting on it. So there's like 3 or 4 different processes of this, and when I first did it, I wasn't as enthused about it until I started getting into it. Yes?
Jacqueline, could you explain the transfer drawing? Joe explained it to us in some process, but I don't think everybody.
Well, I just went in and did a drawing with the ink. Isn't that right, Joe? I just did a drawing right on the plate.
Ink the plate and put the thin, like Kozo paper down on it.
Yeah.
Use a wooden.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So I inked the plate with, you know, the brayer.
If you go back
And
one, you can see it as a transfer drawing before the monotypes had, maybe back to 3.
that right there. And that's what I did. And I had a little, like a little piece of wood, and I just did a drawing with the wood. Remember that? The end, huh?
It's actually a knitting needle.
I used that, but also I used the end of a paintbrush, a little wooden thing. And then I used something else to give it some shade, and I did some detail, and it was, you just use whatever's there. And I wiped my hand over it, yeah. Thanks, Joe. And then I added the color. And that's a separate step. And then I did a plate with the apples on it, and we ran that through. And then I went in and did some hand painting on it because it just wasn't there yet. With all those processes, you'd think that it was done, but it wasn't there yet. And so I did some hand painting on it, and then it was done. And this is the only one. I mean, there's not an addition. And that was the apples. But, you know, in this whole process, there's really nothing more rewarding than pulling up the paper to see the print for the first time. It's like magic. And you never know what it's going to be, and you put all this work into it, and it can be for a long time or just a few minutes. And you put that paper down, you run it through the press, you pull it up, and you never know what it's going to be. There's no guarantees, and then you work with it. And in most cases, you know, we had something. This is Flutter 1, and I used the Prussian blue ink and had to improvise on the butterfly images. We ran out of ink because I kept using all of it. And this is the phthalo green. And this is actually it ended up being one of my favorites. It's a transfer drawing with monotype, and I went in and did some hand painting in the end, and it's titled Wind. And then I did a piece of roses where I just painted the roses with watercolor, so I have one of those, and then Joe did a digital, just a few of them, and it's a wreath of roses, and then I went in with watercolor on each one and hand painted the bird activity. Flight of birds on the inside, and so there's no two alike, but there's similar. And that was a nice experiment. This is my latest painting of the show that's up now, and the name of the show is The Other Landscape, and I just opened it I think 2 weeks ago, and this is titled After the Rain, parentheses, Methane. And it's very large. And these last few images are going to be of the paintings in that show, just to give you an idea of how they relate to the prints and to the installation. Apple tree. Alchemista. Oh, that's a shame. I'm real interested in graffiti, and so a lot of my paintings will have graffiti all over the boat or all over a tree or all over something. And there is a lot of beautiful graffiti in New Orleans, but most of it occurred after Katrina, and there were some gangs that stayed, and they actually made some of the most beautiful graffiti in our city, and one of them was, the gang is called Harsh, H-A-R-S-H. So I used the name of them in all of my paintings because they had the best artists in their gang. This is a landfill series that I did, and these are intimate in scale because the landfills are so huge. I wanted to make them monumental in scale by making them small. And this is oil on wood, oil on board, and it's titled Landfill Mountain, Landfill Mound, Landfill Pile, and this is my boat Orchidea. I took it out of the Amazon and put it in the Arctic. Landfill Heap, Landfill Refuse, and this is titled The Other Landscape. And that's the last painting. Thank you. Yes, Carol?
Do you like Max Ernst?
Oh, yes.
I see a lot of Max Ernst.
Oh, thank you. I don't feel that close to his work, but I love his work. Yes, I love his work. But I loved a lot of the female surrealists a little bit before that. Yeah, yeah.
I have a quick one. What's the size of this painting?
About 3 by 4 feet. Yeah, for me. Yes.
In the older maps, they depict the waves in these old ancient maps like this, and with the sea dragons and
I love those.
yeah, those are
Well, I don't know if you recognize any fish.
well, I see a porpoise.
Yeah. Well, those are like little ghost fish, but some people didn't notice that in the show, and then when they discovered it, they were looking at everything. So, but I just, I love imagery, and and my work obviously is about the narrative, and I like stories, but I also like conceptual ideas with the imagery. And I love ambiguity and irony, and it's just the type of literature and film and visual art that I've always been drawn to. And I mean, even Shakespeare, every line in his work means at least 2 different things, and you can take it this way or that. I mean, even he himself, whoever he is ambiguous, and so I just love that in art. And so it's for viewers' interpretation, but of course, it's also universal and personal.
Does the name of your boat mean anything specifically?
Orchid? Well, it's Orchidea.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Portuguese for the orchid. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed that the roses and the rat show up quite a bit in a lot of your works. Can you elaborate on their significance to you?
With the rat,
Yeah, and the
rodents,
roses.
period. I spend so much time with rodents in Brazil, and the rodents the rodents we have are like this, and theirs of the same ones are this big. And I think they're just a part of my environment and my company, because I don't see any humans for a couple of weeks. And but there's a lot. I don't have the answer to everything because a lot of it is from the subconscious, And I do drawings of these little these big creatures and little ones, and they're just a part of my visual vocabulary.
What about roses?
Roses are, I don't really know. I just feel really close to flora and fauna. I mean, I traveled with so many botanists and ethnobotanists and mammalogists and ornithologists that I learned so much from them, and I listen to them talk about things, and then I end up in Brazil at the Universidade do Amazonas in the biology department studying the botany. And every country I go to the botanical gardens, which are really jungles. They're not pretty buildings like in DC or Kansas City. They're jungles, and where there's jaguar and snakes, But it's the only way to see the orchids, and no roses, but all different types. But I love the design of the rose, and I love the way it unfolds and the way it closes and all the symbolism and all of that. And the deeper the red, the better. Yes?
Your trees are almost always the almost symmetrical tree with the root and the branches almost interchangeable. Do you ever look at other trees?
Yes, I've painted them, but my trees could be many species. I mean, there's Inga, there's oak, there's, maple, there's everything in my tree, Samuma.
They seem very similar.
It could be. I am not, nothing is scientifically correct. And scientists sometimes, that might agitate some scientists, but I'm not a scientific illustrator. And I remember when I was studying the birds at LSU for a few years, and the scientists started inviting me to the Christmas parties. And sometimes they would take me to the side and say, look, I can help you paint your birds a little more accurately. And I said, oh, how, and I just went along with it. Finally, when they realized, they said, you got me. So, and then they kind of apologized. And these were like, world-renowned scientists, like Dr. John O'Neill is the one that actually came to me because he's also a bird illustrator, and he did Birds of Peru, the big, thick book, and he did most of the paintings for them. And I went to his house, and he actually took me on the side, and he's discovered more new bird species than any living scientist. And so when he spoke, I listened to it because I respect that, but I wasn't going to change my birds. Yes.
This might sound kind of strange, but I love seeing your recent paintings, and some of them are kind of complex, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to flip back. Was there one called World Journey?
Yes.
Would you mind going back to that?
Oh, that's all right. Wow. Here we are. World Journey.
Strangely poignant. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Is that a water?
Water spout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought so. I just wasn't sure.
We have a lot of those in New Orleans, in Lake Pontchartrain. Actually, there's a lot of that painting not showing, I mean, not that much was gone, but some more of the canoes and the animals you could see. But this is in a private collection in Houston, and And it is, I'm going to guess, about this big. I can't remember the exact dimensions. Anything else? Any more questions?
Well, I'm sure Jacqueline would love to talk with everybody. We're going to have some refreshments outside. I want to thank you so much. I also wanted to just say that in addition to what is in our exhibition, we have been very lucky. The Sonatas have given us some pieces that show Jacqueline's process. And so we have a linoleum block, we have some of the test pieces and things like that. So it's really great for us to have those wonderful extra pieces which enable us to understand Jacqueline's work better. We also just acquired Migration, the monoprint that you saw tonight, and one of the rose wreath pieces. So just are new to our collections here. So our collection of Jacqueline's work will continue to grow. So
Thank you.
it's all really good.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming in.